somewhat to the Groundhog Day situation by also being a world in which history didn't have its usual meaning and what we should think about that. It also became clear to me that Russell's 5 Minute World showed us that what we cared about in current and future states was the current informational state and not prior states. And so it was of little importance whether these prior causal states actually existed. What I decided was that content similarity, mostly of the psychological kind, was the sole determiner of identity. But at this stage, I meant the narrow content within the person themselves, and any content identical to that outside the person, the extended self. In order to help prove this view as the correct one, I became interested in the case of Swamp Man and the extensive literature on whether a randomly created being can produce meaning. I was interested in this because a randomly created being has no causal history. Swamp Man is an example introduced by Donald Davidson, whereby a person enters a swamp and is hit and vaporized by lightning. Then, at the same moment, a different bolt of lightning hits nearby, and by some very unlikely occurrence, the second bolt creates an apparent person, functionally identical to the original. The question is whether this closest continua duplicate has thoughts and could generate meaningful statements. To me, it was obvious that it did, and my question was whether it should inherit the same rights and responsibilities as the person who entered the swamp. I believe that this could be a relevant example in the philosophy of personal identity as well. My idea was that since would have to extend to a being which had no causal history, humanity, personhood, and other valuable traits, then that would in itself prove that causal history was not important to us. I was puzzled as to why the example had been introduced in an attempt to prove the opposite thesis, that Swamp Man could create no meaning. When I questioned visiting Professor Sally Hasslinger as to her intuitions on the Swamp Man case in the event that her husband Stephen Yarblow was replaced by a Swamp Man, I was very surprised that her intuitions did not match mine, and became further fascinated by the philosophy of personal identity. I thereby changed my thesis to be focusing on personal identity rather than repetitious situations. Initially, my thesis focused on trying to prove that a causal link wasn't important in survival or personal identity, but rather content similarity was. I came into contact with Parfit's ideas on personal identity, which have a causal link between two temporal stages, as well as similarity between psychological content as one of the requirements, but it is far from clear what he means by cause. I agree with Parfit that what matters with respect to what we should care about is not identity but something else. Parfit takes that thing to be relation R, psychological continuity and or connectedness with any cause. I take what matters to be similarity between two space-time points to as wide an extent as possible, including our current interpersonal relations, with a causal link not being necessary to survival. Parfit says that there is no further fact about personal identity other than psychological continuity and or connectedness with the right cause, and the right cause is any cause. More importantly, he says that there is no further fact about whether a future person is worth caring about other than psychological continuity and connectedness. My main disagreement with Parfit is regarding this further fact. I agree there is no further fact in the sense of a magical essence, yet there is a further fact in what I initially called the extended person as the identical traits we share with others, and later the network identity as the network of connections which we have with others. This is something often totally overlooked by philosophers in studying personal identity, even though it is one of the main criterion by which ordinary people define identity, how they are seen by others, and the identity applied by others. I seek to prove that the ordinary people are right in this instance. In this way, I hope to have met Professor Haslinger's worry. A swamp yarblow may not be as good as a regular yarblow just because of social concerns about such things as randomly created beings. The social links may not exist between the swamp yarblow and other people in the same way. This extrinsic view is quite an outlier in the literature on personal identity, would be similar to the view that a deleted file is not as good as a regular file on a computer. The fact is that when a computer deletes a file, it does not actually delete it, but rather tells the operating system to no longer regard it as existing. So content similarity of a deleted file is the same as a regular file, yet how it is regarded by the network that is of critical importance. Late in writing the thesis, I came to two new understandings. One is that although I believe there is a further fact about identity when Parfit does not, I believe there is no final fact which determines identity in all conceptual cases. Parfit believes something like this when he says that it is not true that our identity is always determinate. I can always ask, am I about to die? But it is not always true that in every case this question must have an answer, which must be either yes or no. In some cases, this will be an empty question. I believe that since under extraordinary circumstance we may not be able to determine identity, and it is impossible to determine the exact boundaries of these circumstances, we can only say that there are conventional facts about identity, but not final logical facts about identity with regards to death, for instance. It is always contingent upon future events whether death holds as being the case. This second realization is to do with the psychological view of personal identity. This is something I call getting it at an intuitive psychological level as opposed to a general intellectual level.